Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Black Love Matters. Black Love Matters is an anthology of essays about Black readers, writers, characters, and stories as they relate to the romance genre of books. Edited by Jessica P. Pride, the book discusses the history of Black people within the romance genre as both the creators and subjects of stories. Each essay offers a different perspective on what has taken place within the genre so far and or what needs to be done to ensure greater participation and representation of Black people. It's worth noting that while there is some discussion of specific books and characters, much of the book's focus is on the genre and book publishing industry. I decided that this year I wanted to do something different for Black History Month. I wanted to do stories that combine Black history with a focus on love, be that familial, romantic, whatever. But to combine these two themes of February, Black History Month and love. I came across this book and it had some really great reviews, so I decided to read it. I thought that it would be a good match for my purpose, for my theme this year. So pretty much, this is a collection of essays, not short stories, but essays from various authors, writers on topics about Black love. And it's defined according to their definition, whatever they feel like discussing, different kinds of love in different forms, but love through the Black lens, which is something that as I was looking through books for one to read, I came to realize it's actually kind of difficult. It's sort of like a problem that I have as well with movies, right? Not because you don't have romance books and movies out there, but many of them just don't fit my criteria. That number one, they be good, which I think we can all agree when you look at the collective of movies, books, those that really stand out, that are really great, are less prevalent than the mediocre and not so great books and movies. So that eliminated quite a number of titles. And so with this channel, I try to go for books that aren't just surface level, right? They need to have some kind of depth to them where we can analyze and discuss them, have opinions beyond, I like this character, I didn't like that one, I like this part, I didn't like that one, so that we could have deeper conversations. And you certainly have romance novels out there, not to take anything away from them. It's not my favorite genre, but nothing against the genre, right? It's just not really my thing. I find the stories can sometimes be very cliche. It's just sort of like the same tropes over and over again. I don't mind reading fiction books where characters fall in love, have relationships, things like that. I think that's great, but I feel like, at least from what I've read, some romance stuff can be cheesy, and for other reasons, it wouldn't quite serve our purposes here. There wouldn't be enough to really dive into or to analyze. But in the opening chapters of this book, I found that it was quite relevant, right? It touched on some of these topics, other areas as well. Let's say Main Street art, the lack of representation of Black people within these different areas. And so when it comes to romance, not to say obviously Black people, love and fall in love, but how that's represented tends to be skewed. If you look at romantic comedies or romance novels, but with mainstream media, you would think that, Black people don't fall in love, that we don't meet, date, and marry like other groups of people. That's not really the representation that you get of Black people, right? More often it's dysfunction, it's who's cheating on who, broken families, arguments, abuse, all this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying those things don't happen, but as with other negative aspects, it seems like when it comes to Black people, there's an overrepresentation of this kind of dysfunction. From my own personal life, I know and I see a lot of people who are happily in love or looking for love, right? Both men and women. So I also know really problematic men and women, right? People that are really cool who are looking for love, or they have great partners. And this is for both genders. So it's interesting to not see that represented. So it's interesting to have this recounting of the history of the romance genre with regards to Black people, right? And as with entertainment, the lack of diversity and its attempts to explaining away by stating this false notion that Black people don't read romance, that Black people don't read much, which I know not to be true, right? That we're not enough of a movie-going audience, or people in general aren't interested in Black stories, that there's not enough interest, the quality isn't good enough and whatnot. But the reality is that, as with other forms forms of media, it's just a lack of diversity. That quite often the gatekeepers, their short-sightedness, their lack of vision results in them because they're unable to see the potential and the possibilities, or because of their lack of interest in these subjects, they kind of end up blocking the release of these projects. That this history that we see in other forms of media, so television and movies, you also see with regards to books. Each essay kind of has like a theme that they discuss, novels, particular authors, subgenres, things like that. But as part of that, they also explore like some facet of Black life, the romance genre, the book industry as well. And so with that, I started to feel like it fit the bill, right? It was talking about broader social themes within the Black community, speaking about, books in a way that, like, you might get a few recommendations for books that you might want to pick up, but in the first chapter, there's less of a focus of that and more discussion about the idea of representation, or rather the lack of representation of Black people in romance. That growing up in Washington, D.C., the author developed this love for romance novels, and in reading them at face value, she didn't really see herself in the character. She didn't feel represented. And this was something that she also experienced watching television and to some degree movies as well, where when she watched TV, because of the overwhelming appearance of white people, of white women, that's kind of what she gravitated to. She didn't see herself in these things that were being put out, in these projects that were being put out there. And as a teenager, who was somewhat offbeat and uncomfortable in her skin, it made her feel a certain kind of way to read these books and to not feel seen or represented in them. And so with that, she began to branch out and explore. She kind of clung to hope for characters being Black, or, finally finding a book where she could imagine herself within this world, without having to completely change who she was. And so as someone that likes books and also not just likes books, but also loves books, movies, things like that, I would say that, maybe I don't necessarily look for representation within movies and books, right? I'm kind of all over the place with movies, right? But I think part of that might be like growing up at different times, like my coming of age, growing up in like the 90s and 2000s, it was a period where there was a lot of representation of Black people in media. I grew up at a time when urban literature was a happening thing. I don't know what's going on with urban literature now, especially since, I've moved out of New York. But for quite some time, I remember my friends and I passing around urban literature books, living in Brooklyn, especially near to downtown Brooklyn. You would have, like, near the train stations, you would have, like, these independent book vendors that would be selling a lot of those types of books. I remember there was also, like, a Black bookstore in downtown Brooklyn where it was easy enough for me to find books written by Black authors about Black people. At that time, you also had a lot of movies and TV shows about Black people that starred Black people. And so I didn't feel like I was missing out on things because I could easily find them. I was growing up at a time when they were more present, more easily available. I would argue that things have changed a bit in years. I think if you had a diverse representation of Black people, right, not only did you have Black people in these various mediums, but you had different forms of representation. So I didn't feel unseen. Like, look at the various singers from the 90s, right? You had so many different groups where, I could look at these female singers and female rappers, actresses and whatnot, and feel represented. There was a plethora of Black women on my TV, in movies, right? And then even in the books that I was reading, right? But I think reading her account, I certainly got the point that she was making, and I didn't disagree with it. It just made me further appreciate the time during which I grew up, right? It gave me a different perspective on representation and made me feel fortunate that I came of age during that time, because had I been born a generation earlier or even a decade earlier, I might not have necessarily felt that way. I might not have felt as seen, because I wouldn't have been as represented in media. A lot of what I consumed growing up, I'm actually appreciative for looking back on it now. So Parker's perspective on growing up at a time when she didn't feel represented, when, she had to go out of her way, like really search out books to find characters who were described as looking like her or a friend or family member. It gave me a different perspective. It gave me a new appreciation. That literature seemingly by chance gave her the things, when she finally found it, Black literature gave her the things that she was searching for. One of the other authors, she takes, there's like this continuous thing of taking issue with the lack of representation, right? You might think it's a minor thing, but in the broader context of the lack of representation of Black people in media in general, where there's comparatively less stories told about Black people. And of those stories told, they're often filled with negative stereotypes that reinforce people's prejudice. It becomes a bigger issue. There's this thing in the media of Black people seemingly don't fall in love like everyone else, right? That we don't love like everyone else. There's like fewer books of this nature about Black people. And then within that, what ends up happening is, as the author points out, when she started to find books, she had to dig for them, because quite often they weren't carried at as many stores or major stores as, your more mass market type books. It's no different than with TV or movies. You think about it, when children grow up reading books about themselves, they end up reading books about like white people and other races. And then when they do read books about themselves, it contains a lot of negativity, a lot of negative stereotypes. Sometimes people pattern themselves after these behaviors, or they internalize and believe these things about themselves. Think about movies and music, the influence that it can have on individuals, and then the impact that it has on the way in which they see themselves, especially if you're a young Black man or a young Black woman coming of age, trying to figure yourself out, reading different kinds of books. You seek out a romance novel and you don't see yourself in there. You see a plethora of books about like white people coming of age, but when you dig into these books, they're filled with stereotypes and things like that about you. Either that, or there's no books, or there are few books like that out there about you and for you. It can affect the way in which you see yourself. And so you have this constant thing of Black women, and also to a degree because of stereotypes about Black men, being viewed as undesirable, being viewed as problematic, but pretty much being viewed as other. And so when you have these ideas in books and people are reading them, that's problematic. Most people gravitate towards and develop an appreciation for the things that are deemed as being good and positive. And so along those lines, when you're exposed to media that paints you as other, that paints you as being the opposite of what's desired, right, or what's good, it affects your psyche. It affects your development. It's difficult for it not to. Moving on, there's a discussion of how in romance novels, various authors have sought to push back against the various facets of white supremacy through characters and their stories. So there's discussion of, there's this idea that instead of feeling as though you're lacking or viewing your personal characteristic traits and features as a negative, because you're seeing yourself through this prism that really isn't meant to fit you, that is really created to portray you in a negative light. So to see yourself in a different way, you kind of have to turn that on its head, where first off, the women authentically like themselves. And while they might struggle, they might have some negative experiences, they eventually end up finding love and acceptance from those around them, but also within themselves while possessing these characteristics. So that in and of itself, right, like that's not the problem. It's like basically saying that they're fine the way they are. There's discussion about hierarchies that exist within the Black community and Black society, where due to white supremacy and the structure then within Black society being in proximity to, even within the Black community, anything that's viewed, the closer in proximity to whiteness, the more positively people are viewed as being, right? So there's this thing of striving for acceptance in general society, of attempting to recreate what's valued, viewing yourself and thus others through this system, through this categorization that you see exists in other parts of society. It's sort of like this idea of Black people should be striving to see ourselves through the eyes of other people, or should we be redefining ourselves and what we view as success and happiness through our own eyes, rather than just simply mimicking what we see in white society. Quite a number of these books, within them, Black people experience racism and prejudice. But one way authors take a few different approaches to handling that, either by having the characters themselves be activists in some form and thus pushing against the system, or by creating worlds in which the communities that they live in which Black people are surrounded by, other Black people. So at the very least, they feel supported by their community, or in some other instances, because of the insularity of these communities, they're not as affected by racism, right? Racism becomes less of a factor. Another thing that's mentioned is that quite often with these books, part of how people achieve freedom is through entrepreneurship. So removing themselves to some degree from having to deal with racism at work, from having to maybe deal with an overbearing boss or annoying coworker, right? And I think a lot of people, regardless of race, have to deal with this kind of nonsense, right? But instead, these people, they strike out on their own. They find success as entrepreneurs, which is a positive thing on two fronts. First, right, obviously running your own business comes with stress and things like that, but they have some degree of freedom from trying to live up to the expectations of working within what would generally be like white society, right? And then on the flip side of that, as quite often their businesses, they tend to create businesses and products that are centered on Black people. So it's like another front as well, where it's like through having their own business, they experience some degree of social freedom as well, right? Freedom from some of the issues that you might have in the workplace as a Black person. But then at the same time, having a company that's focused on serving the Black community or providing products that would be used by the Black community, they then become a resource within their community. And so insulating the Black characters either within a community or a world that's predominantly Black, it's like, if you think of Black Panther, right, to some degree, even when you look at like movies, TV shows where the story primarily takes place within a Black community or predominantly Black city or town or something like that, it allows the focus to be placed on the characters as people, as individuals, rather than, sure, there's racism in the world, but approaching things through this means that not that you escape racism, but it allows the focus of the story to be placed on the characters and individuals rather than being centered on whiteness, right? Instead of being about racism and the things that people experience at the hands of white supremacy within that system, it can instead focus on Black people living and interacting with each other, right? Because it's less about the effect of white supremacy on Black people and more about the relationships between Black people, which is actually like a tremendous shift in focus when you think about media in general. There's also some discussion of being like queer. Like there's one author who's a self-described bisexual Black woman. And again, you have this thing of lack of representation in books, right? Where she had to go out of her way to find representation in characters. But she explains that she managed to find this in movies that had been adapted from books. So one of the examples she provides is The Color Purple. And this relationship, this friendship that turns into more between Celie and Suge, and how she related to that as her own experiences, right, as an adolescent mirrored Celie's awakening. This oft-repeated thing of struggling to find yourself, right, and in mainstream media as a Black person. Like I said, I don't really read a lot of romance books, so I can't really speak as to what's out there, but looking at movies, music, television, I could see, what she's saying, right? Where it's like for people of color, in general, there's a lack of representation. And then the representation that is there is largely driven by stereotypes and tropes. So it's like, when you think of representation, until maybe the last 2 years or so, gay, lesbian, bisexual people, members of the LGBT community, they as well tend to be pushed into these like categories and stereotypes, right? Where gay Black men are typically shown as being effeminate, over the top, dramatic, and whatnot. Females are shown as being the opposite of that, more masculine, aggressive. And the reality is, people who would consider themselves to be of either group or, transgender or anything else on that spectrum, it's more complex than that, right? Like they don't, as with other people, they don't fit neatly into these categories. And, these stereotypes that are often placed upon them, like anyone else they're hoping to find and give love, and who they are, what they look like, is just as every bit, diverse as it is with heterosexual people. And this thing of being at that age of trying to figure out yourself, figure out dating, understanding your identity, who you want to be, I think many of us begin to deal with that in adolescence, and it actually continues well into early adulthood. And it's also the case for people in the LGBT community, where literature, as is explained here in the book, serves as both commentary through art, but also an escape. When you're not seeing yourself in books, it can have an effect on how you see yourself, on your development, right? It's important for you to be able to look towards literature, other mediums, and things like that, and see a reflection of yourself. She explains that, as with many things, because this is more part of the human condition, like, it's out there, you just have to know where to look. Or it's out there now, right? You just have to know where to look. And the effort that you have to make as a Black person to find these things, because they're not always made readily available for you. Probably one of my favorite chapters in the book is that of Adriana Herrera, a Latinx Black woman who speaks from the perspective of romance, right? But Black Latinx romance, right? Same genre, but she discusses like telenovelas and things like that, right? Something that I noticed throughout the book is that while they discuss books and literature, some leeway is to be given, because TV shows, movies as well, they begin as scripts, right? Words on a page, which to some degree you can then argue is like a visual form of literature. And so with that, she discusses her perspective based on her experiences having been born and raised in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. And this thing of being Latina, but specifically a Black Latina, growing up in an island that has a history that's deeply immersed in Blackness, in which, predominantly Black figures loom very large, right, in Black history, but in which whiteness is centered. A society that centers on whiteness, despite the majority of people in Dominican Republic, the entire island really of Hispaniola being Black or of some African descent. And so there's a view of being Dominican first rather than Black first. And that's not to say there's anything necessarily wrong with that, or having national pride or taking pride in your specific culture, but rather that to a degree, it's less about celebrating your culture and the experience of where you're from, and seemingly more about distancing yourself from your Blackness. And so with this, she kind of describes her experience growing up as a kid, being exposed to telenovelas, these like Spanish soap operas that were a very large part of her life. Actually, her first and earliest exposure to romance, but in getting older, and something that she took notice of from a very young age, in part because her parents worked in the industry. They were very successful in the business of broadcasting telenovelas. But eventually she fell out of love with these telenovelas, because she came to realize that the people didn't really look like her. On the rare occasion that they did, there was a bit of colorism, right? That might not be the right term here, but there was definitely specific characteristics subscribed to people of color, people who were Black, right? Where she spoke specifically about like the representation of female characters, where those who sort of had more of like a European appearance, European type features, would be ascribed positive traits and associated with positive attributes. And there were definitely some issues, like she mentions, sexism, misogyny, all of those kinds of things. But it's like on the rare occasion when you would have a Black female character or a Black male character, they would be ascribed all of these negative characteristics. Like there was this one particular telenovela with someone who looked something like her, right? An obviously unambiguously Black woman sitting down to watch the show and just being thoroughly disgusted by the character and disappointed in the show. Here it is that finally you have this person who looks somewhat like you, or is a Black person like you, and the character, the way they're presented, is just disappointed because of how stereotypical it is, because of the negativity of the portrayal. And so with that, she makes some connections between the telenovela and broader Dominican society, where there's this great negativity associated with Blackness. There's a strong desire to disassociate from Blackness. And I think that's something you see throughout, that's touched upon throughout the book. This lack of representation, and that when Black people are represented, they're portrayed in such a negative light. It becomes something that, I think this is something that you see in society, where people make an effort, whether conscious or subconsciously, to disassociate themselves from Blackness, to move away from Blackness, to center instead on whiteness, to move closer, to be in proximity to whiteness. All the problems and whatnot and all the problems that causes. I thought she offered some really interesting insights, as well as, discussing kind of the culture shock of leaving the Dominican Republic, where because most of the people were somewhere on the spectrum of being Black, it made people regard themselves as being Dominican first rather than race first. And so far down the line and moving to America, where now she had all of these intersectional qualifiers placed upon her of being Black, being female, being Hispanic, being an immigrant, it just made things a lot more complex. And in a sense, it kind of required her to take a closer look at herself, to redefine herself, to ask questions about herself. And it brought some degree of discomfort and awakening of sorts. But then she mentions leaving America and moving to Ethiopia, where she lived for a period of time, and feeling that finally in this place where Black was the norm, and unlike in the Dominican Republic, people didn't try to put distance between themselves and their Blackness. In Ethiopia, she felt life was centered on Blackness. It felt more natural. She felt most at ease there, as this quintessential part of who she was deemed normal, was deemed acceptable, and not something to be excused, to be explained away or brushed aside. She began to read romance novels, and it wasn't until she'd gone through some life changes a bit later that she kind of settled on the romance genre. But even there, she experienced some disappointments. She mentioned going to a literary event, and there was a female author who was quite successful, very well respected, that pretty much brushed off questions about Black representation in romance, as she didn't believe that the building blocks of the genre related to Black people, as she didn't believe it was possible for Black people to achieve this thing referred to as living happily ever after, which kind of goes back to this thing of the belief within industries that Black people, of not recognizing the humanity of Black people, that Black people are much like anyone else, loving and looking for love. And so it kind of becomes this thing where, in seeking out themselves and stories to speak to them within the genre, some were fortunate to find authors that spoke to them, but for others who couldn't find what they were looking for, they ended up writing. Because of them not seeing themselves in the things that they were reading, or after much digging, when they finally found someone that was speaking to them and their experience, it motivated them to get some of those things out that they've been feeling, that they've been thinking about. And once again, it goes back to this thing of representation, which is like really the driving theme throughout the book. It's even discussed with regards to historical fiction, that romance and really like the genre, right? Granted, there's some preconceived notions, on my part about what the books would include and entail. But as she discusses, it's actually like, romance is like the most popular genre, right? That with regards to Black authors and writers, there tends to be a lot of pushback because of the expectations that people hold, where there's an expectation for books, as with other topics, to center on whiteness. And when that's not the case, a lot of people find it jarring. So with that, you get a lot of pushback from book editors, readers as well, reviewers, where they have preconceived notions about these books, what they should entail, right? She discusses how, in a discussion about someone's book, right, like reviewers online were discussing the book. It takes place, I think, like in the 1800s in America. And there's an automatic assumption that if the characters are Black, the stories have to be about them being enslaved. But the reality is, you certainly had a large percentage, and really probably the majority of the Black population was enslaved, but you also had freed people, right? There was more to America than just the South. And so it's important to tell the stories of enslaved people, but it's also realistic to tell stories of people who lived at that time who were not enslaved, right? So there's conversation about how even within books that are about Black characters, depending on who's writing them, that whiteness is seen as the default, right? Things center on whiteness, where a major defining characteristic for Black characters in the case of interracial romance is the default of whiteness. So characters don't really have to be stated as being explicitly white. It's just assumed. The most might be like features and characteristics might be described with, to define their whiteness, right? Whereas with Black characters, it's the first defining characteristic, where before anything else, their character is categorized according to their race, which isn't an issue, but rather it alludes to the default of whiteness, where a white person doesn't have to be defined by their race. It's just naturally assumed that they would be white, right? Because that's viewed as the norm. So the things that fall outside of that perceived norm have to be given definition, have to be explained. I've read historical fiction, but not historical fiction from a romance perspective. So I would think, even in the case of historical fiction, where whether it's a location, an event, or something like that from history, you write a fictionalized account, I wouldn't expect for it to be exactly fact-based. It might take inspiration. It's like quite often white readers, one of their fallbacks with regards to historical fiction about Black characters is a lack of belief about statements that the story is, historically inaccurate or it's unrealistic. And I would think that's part of like fiction, right? I don't need it to be exactly fact-based. I feel like as long as you don't go overboard, you can take some creative license. I thought the chapter was actually pretty interesting in that she briefly touches on book covers and how they're used to appeal to audiences, where trying to appeal to the largest audience to ensure the viability of books, the sale of books, the default tends to try to be to appeal to white audiences. And as part of that, it's pointed out that quite often book covers, the characters were one possibly presented as being racially ambiguous, light in color to the point where you can't really tell whether or not they're Black or white. And then in addition to that, the people are seemingly more comfortable with the presentation of interracial couples in these period pieces rather than, two Black characters. And so I thought that was pretty interesting because the reality is, I think going back to this thing of literature and its different forms, you see this as well in recent years with television, with movies, right? There's nothing wrong with people being in an interracial relationship, but what you find is that we're getting to this thing where with representation of Black people, the way that's often presented or Black love is presented is through interracial relationships, a Black man and a white woman or a Black woman and a white man. Right? That tends to be the image that's more readily put forward of a couple, right? A Black man or a Black woman with someone of a different race. And it's like when we speak about Black people being shown on TV, rarely do you see a couple where it's a Black man, a Black woman, and they're like happily in a relationship. It's an interracial couple, more likely, if they're like happily married or happily coupled up. What you have to look at when we speak about diversity, you'll still see couples where it's like a white man and a white woman, but you won't see as readily an interracial couple and a fully Black couple. So it's like when you think of like television, when you think about books, movies, there's like more comfort with there being a Black and white pairing, or more interest, rather, the belief that there's more interest in the Black and white pairing rather than a couple where both of the partners are Black. And this is regardless of whatever the sexual orientation of that couple, right? Being a man and a woman, a man and a man, a woman and a woman, or whatever combination, there seems that there's discomfort in showcasing healthy love and romance between Black people. And I want to be specific, like you have dysfunctional relationships and things like that, negativity. It seems there's more comfort showing that kind of stuff between Black couples rather than showing a healthy, loving, fulfilling relationship between two Black people. It's like when you see those healthy, positive relationships, it's more likely an interracial couple. When you see a happy, well-adjusted Black person, they're usually with someone of some other ethnic group or race, right? Whereas white relationships are shown in a prism of configurations, right? From dysfunctional to loving. But when it comes to Black people, the dysfunction comes in, right? When there's two Black people. And it's like happiness and positivity only exists when it's a Black person with someone of some other ethnic group or race, which I think is unfortunate. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noire Histoire website by the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.